Welcome to France. It's 1694, and King Louis XIV is well into his 60-year reign. From the time he came to the throne, he faced a civil war against his own family, the Parliament, and the people of Paris. He was insanely paranoid of revolt. He made everyone that was in power stay in this massively ornate palace at Versailles to keep an eye on everyone. He ruled absolutely and without question. Meanwhile, roughly 20 miles from the palace, Voltaire was born, and he would make all that come crashing down. Louis XIV, although he looked like he ruled with unlimited power, like with all dictators, he relied on other people to run his kingdom and plan his wars. But he fought too many wars, and he was desperate for money, so he had to resort to sell positions in his government and in the legal system for money. One of the people that benefited from selling legal offices was Francois-Marie Arouet, now an assistant lawyer, the father of Francois-Marie Arouet, later known as Voltaire. Francois-Marie didn't listen to authority. He had a rocky relationship with his dad. He was pretty rich though, so he hired two bishops to teach Francois-Marie, but they weren't exactly into their religion, and they were more into the Enlightenment, and basically taught him to be more skeptical of religion until it was time to go to school at the Louis le Grand. And like all schools, it was boring as hell. Reciting sermons, hymns, and memorising Bible passages was really boring. But since he was at the best school in France, he hung around a lot of poets and playwrights that hated the monarchy and restrictions on freedom of the press that Louis XIV put on them. He got into writing satirical poetry, talking about politics of the day, and he's getting pretty good at it, and he's gaining a reputation. So in his final year, Francois-Marie decides to tell his dad, "I don't want to become a lawyer after school, I want to be a poet." His dad didn't take it well. "A poet? After all the education I spent on you, do you intend to be a wastrel? Be a burden on the family? To die poor? Don't you realise how hard I've worked to get our status? Where's the job security, the intellectual seriousness, the moral worth? You're going to be a broke alcoholic. Do you think you're going to be the next Virgil? The next Sophocles?" Instead, his dad forced him to go to law school, and considering he'd get kicked out of his house, and more importantly, his inheritance, if he didn't, he decides to go to law school. He tried really hard for 3 months. But it was so boring, and writing poetry and insulting the government was too much fun, but he's starting to get noticed. A few months after abandoning law school, Francois gets a letter in the mail. It basically said something like this: "Hey, so I shared some of your poetry around, and the nobles at this place really liked your stuff, so they wanted to offer you a place to stay, at a castle. Do you want to come?" Francois-Marie, giving the side eye to his dad, says yeah, and legged it straight there. When he got to the house in the countryside, he was pretty amazed, especially with Louise Benedicte Bourbon, the person who ran this whole place. She left that massive palace at Versailles and created a little court, where she entertained famous people and immersed herself in politics. She also invited a bunch of poets and playwrights for fun and parties. All these writers helped Francois write more poetry and refine his craft. Then the news came. Louis XIV, the longest reigning monarch in the history of Europe, was dead, and politics was heating up. And this is when his writing took on a lot more political tone. Since Louis XIV was so old, he outlived his son and his grandson, and they died suspiciously within a year of each other. And the new king was 5, and he couldn't exactly rule himself. So, a load of people wanted to rule the kingdom for him until he was old enough. So he begins writing a load of stuff attacking Philippe, the official regent of France, who was the guy that was supposed to be running the kingdom for the young king. He said that Philippe had Louis and his son poisoned, and also that he was a bit too close with one of his daughters. Philippe heard and read what Francois wrote. He wasn't happy. Francois was getting some popularity and an ego, and people were starting to question Philippe's rule. He needed to be dealt with. A few months later, Francois was walking around Paris, and Philippe approached him and said, "Well, it seems you know a lot about the court and the current political climate, but I can show you something you haven't seen, the inside of the Bastille. Francois said, "Oh, I'll take that as seen." Even though he was clearly given a warning, the fame was just too much. He kept writing, but someone published some really bad stuff and blamed it on him, and Philippe followed through with his threat and jailed Francois in the Bastille. When he was ordered into the Bastille, being young and cocky, he said, "Oh good, I need a week's rest." He would be in there for 11 months. He didn't care though. He was going to keep writing. He was going to say what needed to be said. Consequences be damned. No one should be imprisoned for expressing their ideas. Freedom of speech is very, very important, and this is one idea he would spend the rest of his life championing. While he was imprisoned, he had a lot of time to think, and he says, "Well, while I was at the Sceaux, my poetry was good, but it wasn't really getting me any more status, or a better reputation, so I'll write a play that's going to be performed in the best theatre in the country. And it's going to be a rip-off, a rework of Sophocles' classic, Oedipus." And it's at this point he decides, "I want a name change. I don't want to be associated with my dad." He was his own man, and it's at this point he changes his name to Voltaire. Voltaire left the Bastille and started his play on Oedipus. He thought, the gods are dumb, the oracle is dumb, and the prophecies are stupid. But I'm uncreative and also lazy, so I'll make the plot believable enough that he can accidentally murder his dad and marry his mum, not because of some stupid prophecy. After 7 months of writing, he finally has the play ready, and it's approved, and ready to be performed in France's greatest theatre, the Comédie Française. It was a huge success, and 25,000 people went to see it for the 2 months it was performed. Voltaire's dad was in the audience, and he finally admitted, "Well, you do have some talent." Being only 18, and after this huge success, he could only go upward, right? Well, after gaining some popularity, after a few more plays, in 1726, a nobleman called Rohan Chabot taunted Voltaire about his name change, and he says, "Oh, are you so ashamed of your parents and of your background that you're willing to change your name?" Voltaire replies, "Well, I'm going to honour mine, whereas you can only dishonour yours." Pissed, Rohan arranged for Voltaire to be jumped. When he got jumped, Voltaire challenged him to a duel. Chabot went home, panicked, cried, and instead got his dad to talk to the royal family, and he got put in the Bastille again. Seeing how rigged the whole thing was, and he knew from last time that he didn't know when he would be out, he could be in there for years. So instead, he goes to court and asks, "Can I go to Britain instead?" The regent thought, well, he's out of my hair, he can't cause that much chaos, and so he lets him go. It's at this point he decides to aim for the literary crown, and instead of copying Sophocles, he was going to copy the kings of epic literature, Homer and Virgil, and make his own epic poem called the Henriade. Voltaire set off for England and set about finding a publisher for his epic poem about Henry IV of France, the king during the French Wars of Religion, who converted from Protestantism to a Catholic. But since Louis XIV took power, he persecuted all Protestants, and France was basically all Catholic, and considering how controversial that subject was in France, he couldn't publish it. But considering how well known Voltaire was with his play and his run-ins with the law, when he wrote it, it was hugely successful. People went nuts, and a load of pirate copies got into France. He writes in the play, religion shouldn't matter to the point of murdering millions of people. Judging by the amount of copies sold, it seemed people agreed. So, after his play was finished, he starts to record his experience in England, in his Letters Concerning the English Nation. This document compares how different England is to France, and how free and liberated the English people were, compared to that mess in France. He writes about the Quakers, who said to Voltaire, "We don't sprinkle holy water on someone's head and claim them a Christian. It's due to their actions, and they can leave as they choose." He writes about politics, and how even though England has a monarchy, there's a limit on their power, and stuff gets solved with votes and talking rather than with guns and bloodshed. And most importantly, Britain's effect on literature and science, especially that occult magician, sometimes scientist, and eternal virgin, Isaac Newton. Nobody really knew who Newton was outside of Britain, and Voltaire writes a lot about him, especially his idea of gravity and optics. It's said that he's the guy that popularised the idea of Newton's apple falling on his head, because it's just an easy way to explain gravity. So this book about religion, trade, politics and science starts doing the rounds in France, and introduced a lot of stuff back into the country. But speaking of France, he was feeling homesick, and sort of broke. It's around this time a mathematician talks to Voltaire about his plan to rig the lottery, and Voltaire eventually got $50 million in today's money. Now, this is where Voltaire really comes into his own, not having to rely on the government to get money, or really bothered about his work reaching a wide audience. It's time for another play, about Brutus, that guy that betrayed Caesar, and in that play he shows how great he was for killing Caesar, for trying to be king, while hoping it would be performed in a theatre owned by the monarchy. It wasn't well received. It would catch on a few decades later though. Then he finally decides to publish his letters concerning the English nation in France. It didn't go well, and people burned it at the French Court of Justice, and he had to hide in different houses to avoid an arrest warrant. And this is where he meets philosopher, scientist, and mathematician Émilie du Châtelet. Voltaire hid at her husband's house, the Marquis de Châtelet, and he sometimes stayed at the chateau with his wife. But that wasn't a lot, and there was a lot of free time when he wasn't home. Émilie and Voltaire clicked immediately. Emily's husband, surprisingly, didn't really care. His marriage was for property and status. He had a mistress anyway. Voltaire and Emily collected around 21,000 books, and they wrote about Newton, philosophy, and science. After 3 years of writing and publishing articles, Voltaire caught the attention of somebody very high up. Not in France, but in Germany. The Prince of Prussia, later known as Frederick the Great, and he was a huge fan of Voltaire's work. They started talking about philosophy, politics, and history, and start writing letters to each other. After a while of talking and becoming king, Frederick becomes way more aggressive in his letters. Treaties are only oaths of deception and faithlessness. The law of kings is the law of the strongest. I have acquired 60 new battalions for the army, plus 5 squadrons of hussars, and a squadron of guards. It's pretty obvious from these letters that Frederick was preparing for war. The French government was scared, and so they called Voltaire, and he was sent to Frederick's court to gauge Frederick's military intentions in the soon-to-be Austrian War of Succession. Voltaire really liked Prussia. He got paid a pension, he didn't have to do anything, he got drunk, he had parties, and he wrote a lot. But Frederick didn't allow Emily to come, and after being away for so long, and Voltaire never actually writing to her for weeks or even months, they separated. Although once he came back from Prussia, they kept up appearances, but the relationship was over. After Emily died, he moved back to Prussia. Life went well for Voltaire at first, especially because he got given money. He wrote Micromagus, one of the earliest pieces of sci-fi, but his relationship with Frederick the Great began to go sour after he insulted Frederick's friend, who was the head of the Berlin Academy of Science. Voltaire got kicked out. He was going to go back to France, but the king banned him for working with Frederick, considering that Prussia and France were at war, and also the fact that he forgot that he was supposed to spy for France. So he has to go back to Switzerland, but learning from the experience, he settles near the border in case he needs to flee again. He would stay there for 20 years. He gets a letter by some guys about this idea. People wanted to make a collection of all human knowledge, the first encyclopedia, and people asked him, "Do you want to write some articles?" He was pretty enthusiastic, but he thought this encyclopedia wasn't going to do much. I would like to know what harm can come of a book that costs 300 livres. 20 volumes of a book will never start a revolution. It's the pocketbooks, at 30 sous, that represent the real threat. And inspired by this idea, he decides to make a dictionary of philosophy, and this is the work that defines Voltaire, and is probably his most influential work. This book does not demand continuous reading, but where or whenever you open it, you will find matter for reflection. This book is meant to spark a conversation. He writes about the Catholic Church, and how the Catholic Church, as organised religion, doesn't actually do much for the people. If there was only one religion, there'd be danger of tyranny, with nobody questioning that religion. If there are two, they will cut each other's throats. But if there are 30, you'll live happily and together in peace. Which was a pretty novel concept, especially for the French, whose wars of religion happened 100 years earlier, led to 3 million deaths. And he also writes about religious sects. There are no sects in geometry. No one says I only believe Euclid and not Archimedes. When truth is self-evident, it's impossible for factions to arise. No one ever disputes there's daylight at noon. There is no justifiable way for people to say their religion is the best, and dismiss all others. He also writes a poem basically insulting and degrading the memory of Joan of Arc, and he makes fun of a guy's theory that we live in the best possible version of the world, by writing Candide. But explaining the genius of that isn't exactly in my wheelhouse. After 20 years, he was getting bored of Switzerland, and with the new king on the throne, he went back to France to see a play he made be performed. He was treated like a rock star, who was celebrated, a massive change from 20 years earlier. But he started to get ill, and within 4 months, he was dead and buried. But his legacy wasn't over yet. Barely a decade after he died, France was descending into revolution, and inspired by Voltaire's criticism of the Catholic Church and of the monarchy, France would become a republic, and persecuted religious people like a fanatic, exactly what Voltaire wanted to avoid. But his drive to question authority, critique institutions, and champion freedom of speech would outlast the revolution, and is a cornerstone of Western democracies, until today.